I'm going to be recording a review of a friend of mine's 50NL Zoom play. He's doing pretty well since he moved up. His first couple of shots failed, but now he's nicely settled at the limits, winning at a reasonable clip, but we think that there may still be a fair few leaks in his game, so we're going to look over his game over today, and indeed probably a series of 3 videos possibly, and hopefully this will provide both some interesting footage for you guys to watch, and also it will be helpful for him. So if we get going, he's going through 3 tabling in this video, and hopefully this should be roughly the right speed for us to both be able to pause, but also and talk about individual spots in more detail, but also be able to keep the footage going without too many dull periods. You'll notice he has some pretty decent samples on some people, which is always going to be useful. And he has a pretty extensive HUD, so we can certainly get that used. Just quickly checking his HUD, you can find it up here in the top left. Yeah, so the one thing that I'm going to comment on here is that personally I'd find using core and 3-bet blind against blind quite counterintuitive, because the stats I'm going to be using most often is going to be the percentage of the time that they're folding blind against blind, which will allow me to evaluate where people aren't meeting minimum defense frequencies against various sizes without having to do any more complex subtraction. So simply put, if let's say hero opens in the small blind to 3 big blinds, he's risking 2.5 big blinds because he's already posted his small blind to win 1.5. He's risking 5 to win 3, so his is essentially the minimum defense frequency for our opponent is 37.5%. If he's folding more than 62.5%, then we can profitably open any 2. And indeed, because this is blind against blind, when ranges are wide and he's guaranteed position, it's going to be a big mistake not to defend significantly more than that as well. I think c-betting ace-10 is probably fine. It's not particularly high up within our range of ace-x hands after opening middle position, and we have backdoor clubs and a backdoor straight draw. We don't have a raise flop c-bet stat, we're just looking it up now, but nearly always I'd just be folding here as a default. Although he doesn't rep a very wide value range, we should note that in general people aren't going to be going batshit bluffing gut shots, etc. here at 50NL Zoom, and also we do block a significant number of bluffs with the ace of clubs. So it sort of works both ways, having the ace of clubs in this. It's better to c-bet because we can turn equity, and if the river's a club, for instance, we can use our nut block as a bluff with, but also it makes it less useful for defending against a raise, because we are blocking the portions of villain's range that we're happy for him to have, given that he probably flats ace-jack or ace-queen of clubs. Against a regular, I would strongly consider double barreling 10-6 here. Given the positions, I expect most regulars to be probably roughly defending a decent amount, despite having a super wide range pre on the flop against a c-bet, but this does leave them with a range for going into the turn with a whole lot of ace-high type hands, some just a lot of combos which are overcards which had backdoor spades or diamonds which are now folding, and not a lot of pairs which want to continue. We also have four fives, which are nearly always good. We can bluff clubs probably, and we can often win the pot on a 10 or a 6. We can probably even value better 10 on the river, given positions. I think as played, we need to be folding. Deuces flushing in a big blind is standard. If the small blind was regular, I'd be taking a note that he does have a flushing range in this position, because it's certainly non-standard to do so, and having a read on what that flushing range is might help us to exploit him both when he's in the small blind and we're in a big blind, and also when we get post-flop with him after he's flatted a raise button against small blind against button. But considering he looks like a fish, given that he's unknown and he has a half stack, I don't think we're going to gain much from that note in particular. Just because we can assume rather that fish probably do have flushing ranges, small blind against button, whereas with regulars it's not something that we want to assume at all. Threes, I mean, you can go either way. I open threes in middle position nearly all the time, but also they're not in my default and under the gun opening range, so you can either have them in both ranges as a default and neither range as a default, or have them in middle position but not under the gun, or whatever you choose. Basically, is not going to be a significant mistake anywhere. Something I would recommend is, rather than simply using a reg tag, I'd recommend using a tag which shows you which regulars are folding too much in the blinds to steals. This is one of the things that I recently implemented in my tagging system. Sorry, we're just going to pause the video here. And it's been one of the most useful things, I think, for my game recently, because often you, especially playing Zoom, you see 9-3 off on a button and you want to turbo fold it. But when, for instance, you have a small blind who's folding 89% and a big blind who's folding 75% in a big blind, they're combined, they're both going to fold 0.79 times 0.89 times 0.75% of the time, which is roughly 3/4 of 90%. God, my maths has gone. It's 22.5%, I believe. Yeah, that sounds about right. Whoops, sorry. It's 72.5%. That could be wrong. Don't hold me to that. And that's if we're min raising a button, we're risking 2 to win 1.5. So we need both to fold. I think it's about 57% of the time to auto profit, so that's certainly a spot that where we should be looking to open any two, and you will start missing those spots if you're playing 3, 4 or more tables and you don't have some kind of colour indication of how much somebody's folding in to steals. I just want to briefly talk about the c-bet spot. So we've got folds of flop c-bet in position and out of position. They're very low for this guy. So despite the fact that he has flatted a small blind, and thus we'd mostly assume that he has a range of maybe suited broadways and pocket pairs, maybe some suited aces or suited connectors, I don't really see what we achieve by the c-bets. Sometimes, yes, we get value from whatever worse overcard decides to float, or some ace 3 through ace 7 suited if he has some pre-flop. But firstly, I don't think he's 3-betting a fairly normal percentage at 7%, so I think we can assume that he's 3-betting some of those suited aces, suited Broadway type hands. And also we've got to remember that, let's say he has 3s through 9s pre, those alone make up 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Those alone make up 42 combos, which is a lot that we have to... There's a lot of worse hands which have to be calling just to justify that, and that's before we start talking about ace-9 suited ace-jack. Suited and offsuit maybe ace-queen, but I think most regulars are 3-betting that. And indeed, it's quite tough to get a specific read on what people are flatting in the small blind before taking notes on it. So yeah, I think c-betting here is a mistake. In that the only real purpose it has is folding out equity against us. We definitely never fold out any better hands, and we're going to struggle to fold out a lot of worse hands as well. And we're going to struggle to get value from many worse hands. I think on this river we just need to fold. After he check calls a flop and then checks back the turn, it's pretty tough to see what he's bluffing with. Oh, I'm sorry, I just realised my analysis for the hand is based on the idea that he's in the small blind and we're on the button. That's of course not true. With that said, I still think c-betting is too thin, because he will have all the ace-x up to ace-jack or maybe ace-queen. Then he's not always going to float with overcards even. He has 2s through 9s. He probably has more 2x combos than otherwise. And so we're still not getting called by worse or getting folded from better. When he does bet this river, I think this is a pretty reasonable line that he might take with king-queen, but moreover, I think he's going to bet most of his bluffs on the turn here. Even though when they get called, so let's say that we're never check calling the turn with unpaired cards, which I think is probably not the case, but that might be perceived to be the case. Even though when he has a flush draw, for instance, given the board trips up, he loses equity against some of our range. I do think that that he's still going to be betting most of his bluffs on the turn. So I think this spot should be a fold. That's good. We can possibly open king-9 suited in middle position, given there's a fish in the small blind. I think ace-queen is pretty standard here. We also have the added benefit of keeping the fish in the big blind in. Under the gun is raising pretty tight under the gun over our sample, but it's still not enough to start justifying folding ace-queen. I'm just going to pop back a second because I didn't see the stats you were looking at there. Okay, so 3-bet versus position. We've opened in either middle position or under the gun. We can see that that a lot of Tonchik's 3-bet percentage here is going to be made up of later position 3-bets, and although these samples are very limited, we can also see that we're starting to get something close to a sufficient convergence sample against EP and MP. So we shouldn't be expecting him to 3-bet a whole ton. So I think just folding ace-queen would be perfectly legitimate here, especially considering he's pretty tight overall. Though an alternative route could be to 4-bet it as a bluff, and I think that's probably alright if we don't want to call it. Calling is marginal, especially given his shortest stack. I mean, the thing about shorter stacks is that they do give you wider stack off range, and thus because you're probably opening your normal range relative to the rest of the table, you can really stop flatting out a position as much, because you can 4-bet call a wider range and thus 4-bet bluff a wider range and achieve your required defense frequency in that manner. Just going to quickly note, I'm not really a fan of the turn bets with ace-3 here. Our opponent seems like a nits. Sometimes he calls with a club, but I think although I don't think they should when given the ace favours our range after checking about the flop so much, I do think there's a lot of people at 50 NL Zoom rather are going to be leading most of their strong club hands on the turn. Obviously this river's pretty awful for us because he has so many more ace-X in his range than we do, and I think we just need to give up. But yeah, I think it's going to be optimistic to suggest that we're actually going to be ahead on the turn very often. So, in all honesty, I think if you're calling ace-queen pre, then it's going to be high enough in your range that you can't really fold that turn. Otherwise, you are just essentially playing fit or fold. With that said, I do think it's quite likely that it's just the calling pre that's a mistake, and so you don't really want to accentuate that mistake by making the further mistake of calling on a turn when it's bad to do so. With that said, I'm not really sure what your assumptions are here. And given that he checks back the flop, I do think we can exclude some other pairs from his range, although less so than we would be able to do against a full stack, because he can still get stacks in over 2 streets given his 50 big blind starting stack. So I think we should probably be peeling that turn, especially as I don't think he's ever going to be betting ace-king there for value. Standard defend with jack 10 off. I think this would be a pretty interesting flop to check raise, especially against this sizing. When somebody sizes like this on this type of texture, I think we can tend to assume that they have some kind of sizing tell. Our opponent's flop c-bet percentage is incredibly high. We don't have fold to flop raise on our HUD, so I'll be interested, even though it's only 390 hands, I'll be interested to see if that pops up. Yeah, that's good. Fold to check raise or fold to raise after c-bet, a completely insufficient sample. But I do think check raising is probably the best play here because our hand, it's pretty borderline about being strong enough to check call, but certainly it's not like we're struggling to find enough hands to check call with on this particular texture. We're also going to want a check raising range on this texture. I think it's probably good to start by range checking this texture. By range checking any board, big blind against button, just because in the big blind after calling a min raise, your range is going to be probably wider and weaker, given this is capped pre-flop compared to your opponent's range. So yes, I like the check raise. I think we have just enough equity to justify it. We do have maybe a slight problem of controlling our frequencies here. So let's say for a second that we check raise all combos of Jack 10 with a diamond and all combos of 10-8 with a diamond and occasionally some other stuff, as well as draws which are strong enough that we're happy to stack them, and 2-pair plus. So Jack 10 with a diamond is, with a single diamond is 6 combos, 10-8 with a single diamond is a further 6 combos, 10-7 with a single diamond, which is roughly the same strength, as a further 6 combos, so that's 18 bluff combos. If we say we're check raising all sets, actually this is less of a problem than I thought it was going to be. We have 9 combos of sets. We presumably have all combos of 7-8 pre, so we have another 16. So really we can actually add some more check raises than I thought. We can, if we don't 3-bet it pre, we can probably check raise 4-3 suited here. Maybe some overcards with backdoors. Jack 10 of clubs, 10-8 of clubs, 10-7 of clubs. That sort of thing. But just to note to the Grinder School audience, because I think that Chris will likely already be aware of this, in deciding what hands you want to check raise bluff with, I think it's probably a mistake to just pick the draws which have the most equity. Especially if you care a good amount about range construction and having appropriate hands in different ranges on different turns of rivers. So, for instance, let's say we always check raise not flush draws. I think the problem is not only that we're in a kind of shitty spot if we get 3 bets, which will happen a decent percentage of the time on this board, even though I personally think that it's a perfectly legitimate strategy to not have a flop 3 betting range in position on most textures. But also we rob our flop check calling range of any nut flush draws. So I think what we're looking for is to include some of all types of draws in both continuing ranges. So we'll want some flush draws to check raise. So ideally the huge ones that we don't mind stacking, we'd want to check raise. So let's say ace 8 and ace 7 of diamonds, and the more showdown, but contrary to that, the more showdown value you have, the less inclined you should be to check raise with any given hand. So I think ace jack of diamonds here, if we don't 3-bet it pre, which it wouldn't form part of my strategy pre-flop, I think ace jack of diamonds would make a fine check call. Same for ace 5 of diamonds, any 5x of diamonds hands. Yeah, and so we can either, so as for check raising draws, we can either check raise draws which we're happy to stack off with, and there it doesn't suck if we get 3 bets, and that's sort of a quasi-value check raise. And we should also be checking check raising draws that we don't mind folding to a 3 bets. Though I suppose if we're overly concerned about balancing our ranges, we should probably have some draws that we want to use for a 4-bet bluff jam. Although I suppose those could be the big draws. Okay, continuing with the video, because I realised I've gone on about this spot for quite a while. I think, yeah, another point just about that Jack 10 spot again is that we should be increasing our flop check raise frequency against this guy, just because he is over c-betting so much. 79% is a frankly ridiculous frequency. So I think we can be perfectly happy just to check raise left, right and centre against him. I think 8s you can either call or fold, it's very close. It's 3-bet 6%, but it's over a limited sample, so we can't read a whole lot into it. And it depends to an extent on what your middle position opening range is. The wider your opening range, the more inclined you should be to defend 8s. Certainly I'd be defending 9s, I'd rarely be defending 7s, 8s is kind of on the borderline there. Threes is a pretty standard check fold on that flop. There's not much to say there, especially 3-way. There's just no way whatsoever it falls within our defense responsibility, and also even when it's ahead it's just so vulnerable to so many turns and rivers, especially considering our opponents are presumably bluffing the hands which make most sense for them to be bluffing with. So I'm not sure I'm keen about the 3-bet with 6s here. Let's see, we do have 4-bet starts on. Okay, this is 4-bet percentage rather than 4-bet range, which I'm going to find a bit tougher to work with. But our opponent's pretty tight to start off with. I think 12% 4-bet is middle to high, but considering his opening range is pretty low in the first place, I don't think that necessarily indicates a wide 4-bet range. I think I'd just be folding the 6s here. I think it's great to use, it's a good strategy to use a depolarized small blind 3-betting range, especially against regs on the button. He's tagged as a fish, but he's 19-16, and with a reg in the big blind. But I don't think 6s needs to form a part of that strategy, except insofar as we can use it as a 5-bet bluff. And the same obviously goes for deuces through 5s. It just doesn't play very well at all post-flop. We are absolutely screwed on most boards because the chance of 2 overcards flopping is pretty significant, and on nearly all of those boards we have to check fold. And not only does this make the hand in question tougher to play profitably, it also means that with the rest of our range we're having to introduce some more questionable check calls and possibly shift some hands that we'd like to value bet into our flop checking range, so that we're not over-folding after checking flops. I mean, I'm not sure that we're really going to get that exploited in that regard at 50NL, but it's certainly something that we can keep in mind. Ace-Jack off can either be a flat or a 3-bet depending on, well, this guy seems like a nit, so I think flatting's better, but depending on how you decide to play your ranges, and I think on this flop it's a very easy check call. Yeah, okay. So I think folding Ace-Jack on that flop is a big mistake. Let's see if we can get the right place. This looks roughly right. Yeah, so our opponent's opening 48% on a button, which is on as high as the side, but you've got to remember it's still a pretty wide range. C-betting 33%, but only over 430 hands, so I'd assume that actually tends closer to 50%. And we have a strong ace high, which can improve against some of our opponent's value hands, and often get to showdown when we're ahead. I think if we are folding Ace-Jack here, we're going to be significantly over-folding this spot, which, although our opponent is not c-betting much over our sample, although this is 33 and 29% in position and out of position actually, although they're not folding much over us, although they're not c-betting much over our sample, we do need to allow for the fact that this is still a relatively small sample size. We need to assume per kind of quasi-Bayesian inference ideas that the stat tends towards the population mean, and thus I don't think it's a sufficient read that we need to be making deviations as substantial as folding Ace-Jack here. And in fact, I think this is possibly an indication that you ought to do some off-table work, Chris, on what falls within the sort of range you need to defend on this type of board, a big blind against button. So just to give you some numbers, our opponent min raise is pre. I assume we have roughly 60% of all hands for calling and a further 15% for 3-betting. Possibly, let's say 50% for calling. That's pretty standard. Our opponent c-bets 2/3 pot. They're risking two to win 3, so risk plus reward is 2/5. Our minimum defense frequency is 60%. However, because on this type of texture we'd like to adopt a strategy of exclusively defending by calling, we need to increase that because it gives EV to our opponent's bluffs. So we probably want to be defending roughly 70% of our range against a c-bet here, and that means that if you combine those two numbers, that means that we probably want to be defending about 35% of all possible hands on this board, which is going to be tough to do if you, let's actually just make this a bit smaller for a second and open up Equilab, just to illustrate something. When it will load in a second, I hope. Here we go. Okay, so let's say we're in a big blind, and just to get an idea, 35% of all hands is about 468 combos. About 400, let's say 450 combos. So we have a flop of King 93 Rainbow, King of Clubs, 9 of Diamonds, 3 of Spades. And because because of card removal, it's going to be even tougher to get those 450 combos. So let's look at our range. Let's assume we have any King X pre. That's a fair few combos, and that's going to be useful. If we probably 3-bet jacks, 10s, and queens, so we can't have those. We do probably have 9s and 3s. We're not going to really have ace king. We will have ace 9 suits and offsuits. Probably the same for queen 9 and jack 9 and 10 9. 9-8 suited and offsuit. Let's also have 9-7, 9-6 suited, 9-5 suited, and 9-4 suited. Those starting to get pretty marginal in 9-7 offsuit. So we're not even halfway to defending the appropriate amount here. Now let's add all the gut shots that we can have, and this is going to start helping a lot. So here we have 261 combos. If we add some pairs that are more reasonable to defend, then we have 273 combos. If we include our bottom pair combos, 285. We probably have queen 3 suited, possibly queen 3 off, and probably jack 3 suited. And we still need to defend another 150 combos. Now, you have to ask yourself where those are going to come from. You don't really want to start defending everything with a backdoor flush draw, because I don't think those hands are going to play as effectively for defending on the variety of turns and rivers as, say, strong ace high. So we probably have ace jack and ace, or the ace jack and ace 10. We can start calling ace 8, I guess. But essentially, you're seeing. I hope you're seeing here quite how tough it is to actually reach a minimum defense frequency, or a reasonable, and thus a reasonable defense frequency on some boards, even against what I think is actually quite a large c-bet for that texture. If the c-bet was a more reasonable size, like 55% pot, then we'd have to be defending close to 3/4 of our range pre-flop, which just isn't feasible. Now, we should note that this is mitigated a little bit by the fact that we were getting great odds pre-flop, so we don't actually need to defend the whole percentage on the flop, but we should still aspire to defend something close to it, provided that we expect to be able to make those hands profitable calls. Which I think we can for pretty much all of this range. I mean, let's just quickly, if I just quickly pause this video and add some hands just to see what 450 combos looks like. Okay, so looking at this range, this is roughly what 450 combos looks like. What I've done is essentially I've added all the ace high and all the queen high backdoor flush draws, which, except for queen deuce suited, which we probably have pre, but this is just what 450 combos looks like, and there may be some difference in preference. So I think 10-8 suited with a backdoor flush draw, or jack 8 suited with a backdoor flush draw is probably a better check call than queen 4 suited with a backdoor flush draw, but it's really going to be tough to reach this frequency anyway. And I really doubt that, to be honest, given that you are folding ace jack, despite the read, I doubt that in a position against a typical regular you're becoming anything close to this range on the flop. So I think that's probably quite concerning. Still, back to the video. And yeah, just you do check that we see the sample size of c-betting in position is 4 out of 12. I do think that's a very low c-bet. I do think it's a very low sample for the adjustment that you're making, as I've said. And again, I think we're seeing another example of this in not 3-betting ace king against a cutoff. Sure, our opponent is 14-11 over 100. I can't see if that's 100 hands exactly or 180. But again, there's a pretty decent chance that this is skewed somewhat by the sample size, and we should assume a degree of tending towards the population mean. So, if we assume he's 18-15 in reality, then we'd probably be 3-betting ace king button against cutoff. Of course, if he does turn out to be 14-11 in reality, then calling ace king here is absolutely fine, but the chance that he actually is probably lower than the chance that he's something greater than that. So I think ace king's probably fine so far. Given the reasons that I assume you flat pre-flop, I'm not sure if you should be actually calling the flop and turn, because we do have to assume that he is a massive nit to call pre-flop. So we probably have an issue of consistency here. I mean, he's opening queen 10 off from the cutoff, which is pretty much in a 24% range or something like that. But yeah, if we do assume that he's tight enough that we shouldn't be 3-betting ace king pre there, then we also should probably be folding probably the flop, because we have to assume that his c-betting range is overwhelmingly top pair plus heavy in that spot. With that said, I would have 3-bet pre and called the flop and then the turn myself. Just as a general note about how the population plays, especially Gary Kay, I've got a fair few hands on him, and he's actually a pretty big nit over my sample, though he isn't over yours. I think we have to assume that delayed c-bets are actually surprisingly value heavy at this limit. So while we definitely can't fold ace 3, we should probably start considering making an exploitative fold if he bets a river. But we should note that this is exploitative. After checking twice, ace 3 is actually pretty high in our range, because we probably don't have any overpairs or top pair hands after checking twice. Possibly not even any second pair hands. So considering we're also going to check twice with a fair amount of trash or ace high type hands, there are actually a lot of combos that we need to account for in designing defense ranges. So I think 9-8 suited here, based on what we've been talking about defending appropriate frequencies, is probably good enough to check call, though it's certainly close to the bottom of that range. It's borderline, but you just have to keep in mind precisely how wide ranges are, big blind against button. Although this is partially mitigated in the hand in question by the fact that it was a 2.5x rather than a min raise. Yeah, I think this is a very standard double barrel with 7-6 suited. We don't actually have that many hands that are pure bluffs here, considering we're probably going to check king x a decent amount on a flop. But I'm not keen on the idea of tagging somebody as a fish and then triple barreling when they probably have a lot of 2-pair hands in their range. And if they have 10-9 off, then it's almost certainly too optimistic. I think we should be besting this turn with Jack 7. Just because getting value from fish is pretty much the foremost concern, and I think we should probably be besting the river a little bigger, just half a big blind or something, because those numbers are going to add up a bit in the long run, and I don't think it's going to affect his calling range at all. I think calling on flop with 9s is pretty good. it actually becomes pretty low in your range on this turn, because a lot of your flop calling range, which isn't a made hand, is going to be stuff like Queen 10, King Queen, or indeed King 10, which obviously now it has improved to being better than nines. I don't think it's quite weak enough that we want to start bluffing with it, especially if, well, it depends how wide we're calling with pocket pairs on a flop, but I assume we're probably calling maybe 6s plus, and if we have 6s, 7s and 8s, then that's already 18 combos that we want to be bluffing with, that we have to bluff with, and it's getting pretty tough to balance that with value combos, especially on the river after we check back the turn. Though we don't actually, I guess we might have to start bluffing some 6s and 7s combos on the turn to actually get any bluffs in that spot. I suppose that's actually a pretty good example of quite how much a turn card can change the design of ranges and change how many bluffs or value hands there are in that particular range, or indeed how a bluff or a value hand should be conceived. So yeah, in all honesty, I think that at 50 we can just take the showdown value justification of not bluffing most of the time. I don't think that where the bottom of our range is what's actually a pretty strong pair. People are going to be good enough at hand reading to understand that, and I think in most of those cases they're going to be calling too much, unless their range is inordinately weak, in which case we can just, well, if their range is so weak that they're not overcalling at 50 zoom, then I think most of the time it's just a spot that we can just bet everything and print money. I think 5s is a decent defend here. When first check raise paired boards, it's something that you don't know quite what to expect with. So I think we need to develop a reasonable defense range, but not a huge one. I think if and just to quickly pause, I think your 4-bet with kings here is a bit big. So you make it 21 big blinds over 9 big blinds, which is 2 1/3 times the size of the 3-bets. In position, I don't think that's really necessary. We really want to encourage him to develop a range for flatting 4-bets out of position, or under defend, or 5-bet far too wide. So I probably make it $9.50 to $10 here. It's not a big deal, but it's something which I think is going to add a very marginal amount to your win rates, and it's probably worth it as a result. I think you should probably be taking a note on that hand, but just waiting for later is also fine. Yeah, so I think against a 2.25x in a cutoff 2.25x, folding King 7 2-stick in the big blind is probably too tight. I think any suited king is strong enough to defend here, given his sizing in the odds and the fact that we're getting 3-to-1 odds on a call. We could also consider 3-betting, but I'd be more inclined to 3-bet against a slightly larger raise, because that would make it less attractive to call with King 7 suited. But I think folding is probably the worst of the 3 options against that sizing, and I think we need to be cognizant of the amount that our defense ranges should change based on other than sizing, especially when we're in the big blind. I think against fish on this flop we probably just want to be raising and getting the money in. He's 16-10, but he's also probably bad. He min 3-bets pre and then near pots the flop, so it just has an overwhelming amount of overpairs in his range, and there are a whole bunch of bad turn river cards. Against this type of player, we don't need to worry about balance because we simply wouldn't be bluffing this spot when he has so many other pairs and we can't expect him to fold many of them. And also, it also protects against turn cards like this, which is a worse turn card in the world for us, except for maybe a 3. Or a 5, possibly. A 5 is pretty gross too. I think we probably want to peel one more with 4-2. Though we can certainly start considering folding rivers. To be honest, though, it would be very close. I think you'd probably have to call, though, guessing 3-1 in case he's doing this with ace-king. Or kings or queens or whatever, yeah. Yeah, so I'd take a note on his flop sizing there, because it's certainly non-standard. Well, everything about the way he played the hand is non-standard, insofar as his sizing goes. So, personally I wouldn't be c-betting 6-4 suited here, though there are also some very good players who would recommend it. I'd be more happy to c-bet, say, 8-deuce of diamonds here. Just because it's that little bit more vulnerable. It's also a fairly decent amount less suitable to be calling turns or rivers with if the turn checks through. So we're just going to watch the rest of this hand and see how it pans out. But also, especially three-way, there's just no way we can get value from second pair here because of the reduction in required defense frequencies three-way. And I think we need to take a note on the fact that he flattered jacks there. So I'm going to stop the first installment here. I hope you've enjoyed this. I've been a Definite Article for Grinder School. I'm going to get a drink and probably record the second installment straight away. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Good luck at the tables. And just as a quick reminder, I am still offering private coaching. My rate is in a couple of days about to go up to $30 an hour, but as a special offer for Grinder School subscribers, I will be offering the current rate of $25 an hour for any sessions booked within the first 2 weeks after this video is published. So once again, thank you. I've been Definite Article. Good luck at the tables.